It was the sort of afternoon that made one believe nothing sinister could ever befall the village of Netherdine. The sun filtered softly through tall hedgerows, bees trundled lazily between blooms, and the scent of fresh cucumber sandwiches wafted from a long white tablecloth fluttering in the breeze. The annual garden party hosted at Fern Hollow, ancestral home of the late Colonel Geoffrey Cranley and his widow Honoria, was the social event of the season, and the entire village had turned out in full pastel. Miss Marple sat beneath a gnarled cherry tree, her lace gloves folded neatly in her lap and her teacup delicately balanced on its saucer. She wore a pale lavender cardigan and a straw hat trimmed with violets, looking for all the world like a kindly grandmother out of a Victorian postcard. Few would have guessed that she was already quietly collecting impressions. "Remarkable. Really," said Mrs. Willett, the postmaster's wife, fanning herself with a programme listing the afternoon's entertainments. "To think Honoria's lasted this long on her own. I thought for sure she'd be taken off by the influenza last winter." Miss Marple smiled kindly, her eyes not leaving the scene before her. Children squealed at a coconut shy. Reverend Sims, too proud to remove his collar, perspired heroically in conversation with the Cranley solicitor, Mr. Bernard Ashcombe. And near the rose arbour stood Mrs. Honoria Cranley herself, tall, gaunt, and wrapped in an oddly heavy shawl despite the June sun. Her expression was unreadable beneath her broad-brimmed hat, but there was tension in the rigid set of her shoulders. A sudden, sharp exclamation sliced through the air. "I will not be dictated to, Bernard. That will is final, and I expect it to be respected." Several heads turned. Honoria's voice, never one to understate, had risen above the clinking teacups and string quartet. Mr. Ashcombe looked flustered, adjusting his spectacles with both hands and murmuring something inaudible. The widow swept past him, her cane clicking furiously on the flagstones as she retreated into the house. Mrs. Willett gasped, delighted. "Do you suppose it was about the will?" she whispered to Miss Marple. "There's been talk, you know." "Talk?" Miss Marple's voice was mild, but her fingers twitched minutely as she retrieved her knitting from the wicker basket beside her. "Oh yes. Changed it just last week, they say, and completely cut out that awful nephew. What's his name? Harold? No, Howard. Howard Green. Used to come sniffing around after the Colonel died, hoping to inherit Fern Hollow. Terribly disappointed when Honoria refused to die on schedule." Miss Marple nodded, working a row of pale blue wool. "One mustn't count one's inheritances before the death certificate is issued," she murmured. A few moments passed. The quartet struck up a fresh tune, and conversation resumed its usual hum, but a ripple had passed through the guests, subtle yet perceptible. Eyes flitted to the French doors through which Honoria had vanished. One could almost sense the polite speculation beneath the smiles. It was just after the tea trays were cleared that the scream came, high, thin, and unmistakably feminine. Every head turned. A housemaid, no more than 16, stumbled out onto the terrace, her white apron stained with something dark and spreading. "Mrs. Cranley, she's... Oh, someone fetch the doctor." Gasps, sudden movement, and the rustling of skirts. Mr. Ashcombe looked thunderstruck. Reverend Sims dropped his lemonade. Miss Marple rose slowly, as if her old joints could only just accommodate the idea of haste. She didn't run. She never did. But her step, as she followed the others toward the house, was steady, measured, quietly resolved. She had already noted the expressions, the positions, the quarrel. Something had happened, and Miss Marple, though the village did not yet know it, had just begun to solve it. The sitting room of Fern Hollow was cool and dim, the heavy curtains drawn slightly against the afternoon sun. The scent of rosewater mingled uneasily with something acrid, spilled, port perhaps, or something metallic. Honoria Cranley lay slumped in a brocade armchair near the hearth, her shawl twisted awkwardly across her chest, as if she had tried to rise and failed. Her eyes, still open, stared without recognition. It was Miss Marple who, though unobtrusively, took in more than the others. The overturned teacup on the small table beside Honoria's chair, the faint bruise beginning to flower at the corner of her mouth, the dark red stain soaking into the hem of her gown, and on the floor, only half noticed by the maid who still stood pale and shaking by the doorway, an envelope, sealed with thick red wax, tucked beneath the edge of a side table, as though dropped in haste. "Stand back, please. Let me through." Dr. Redfern, summoned from his card game at the vicarage, brushed through the crowd that had followed the scream, still clustered in the hallway like curious cattle. He knelt by the body, his face tightening as he took the widow's wrist, then leaned close to listen for breath. After a long moment, he straightened with a weary sigh. "I'm afraid she's gone." Gasps again. Mrs. Willett fainted delicately into the arms of Reverend Sims, who looked torn between alarm and flustered gratitude. Mr. Ashcombe, face pale, ran a shaking hand through his thinning hair. "Dead?" he asked, voice rising. "But I was just speaking with her only half an hour ago." Miss Marple's voice, when it came, was like a feather brushing against velvet. "Forgive me, Doctor. May I ask if you saw anything unusual?" Dr. Redfern gave her a brief glance. Many still underestimated Miss Marple, though she had made herself impossible to ignore in certain circles of late. "She appears to have suffered some kind of seizure," he said cautiously, "but I'll have to report this to the authorities. It's standard, of course, in sudden deaths." "There was a quarrel," Miss Marple said softly, to no one in particular. "Mr. Ashcombe, wasn't there something about a will?" Ashcombe blanched. I hardly think now is the time, Miss Marple." Miss Marple inclined her head gently, knitting tucked primly in the crook of her elbow. "Of course not. But one wonders." She seemed quite distressed. The envelope, still half hidden under the table, caught her attention again. She stooped, delicately plucking it up with a tissue from her handbag as if merely tidying. "I do believe this may be important. It is addressed to you, Mr. Ashcombe." He took it with trembling fingers. "My word, it's her seal." The police arrived in due course. Inspector Craddock, a sharp-eyed man with a worn notebook and a habit of drumming his fingers when irritated, was well familiar with Miss Marple. He offered her a polite nod before turning to the scene with professional detachment. "No signs of forced entry," he said, after interviewing the staff. "No witnesses to any struggle. Yet the widow is dead, and there's a fresh draft of her will missing from her writing desk, according to Mr. Ashcombe. You're certain it was here this morning?" "Quite," said Ashcombe. "She summoned me yesterday and insisted we finalize it today. I was to collect the signed draft after the garden party, once she'd reviewed it privately." Miss Marple sipped her tea from the china cup someone had thought to bring her. "And yet she never got the chance," she murmured. "Inspector." Craddock turned to her. "You saw her last?" "Only from across the lawn," Miss Marple replied. "She seemed composed, if rather forceful, during your conversation with her, Mr. Ashcombe. And then she left quite abruptly. I found that curious." Craddock raised a brow. "You suspect something?" "I wouldn't dare to use such a word. But I've found, through long observation of human nature, that strong emotions, when suppressed, rarely stay so." Craddock gave a non-committal grunt, but he didn't dismiss her. He never did entirely, not after the incident with the vicar's niece and the poisoned strawberry jam in Little Paddocks. "We'll need to speak to the staff. And the nephew, Howard Green, is it? Was he here today?" "No," Ashcombe said. "Though he was invited, I believe. Miss Cranley had rather soured on him recently. They had disagreements about money." "Did they now?" Craddock made a note. "Very well. We'll need to have a word with him." Howard Green arrived the next morning in a rather ostentatious motor car, the sort with sleek fenders and a rather unnecessary horn. He was dark-haired, sharp-featured, and tried a bit too hard to look unbothered. His tie was too loud, His shoes, too polished. "She's dead, then," he said, barely waiting for Craddock to confirm it. "I suppose I should pretend to be surprised." "That would be decent of you," Miss Marple said gently from her seat by the fireplace. Howard glanced at her. "And you are?" "Merely a neighbour. I often find myself nearby when people begin to tell half-truths." Craddock coughed pointedly. "Mr. Green, your aunt died under unusual circumstances. There was a dispute regarding her will." "You don't say." Howard let out a short, joyless laugh. "She'd been promising me Fern Hollow since I was 10. Then she decided to live. Forever. Frankly, I'm amazed she didn't fall over years ago." "She changed her will," Craddock said flatly. "Yesterday. Mr. Ashcombe was to collect it this afternoon, but it's gone missing." Howard spread his hands. "You think I took it? I wasn't even in the county. I was at the club in London. Ask anyone." "We will," Craddock replied. "But you'd best not leave the village." Howard's eyes flicked to Miss Marple again. Something about her unsettled him. "Funny old bird," he muttered under his breath as he left the room. Later that evening, Miss Marple sat quietly in the vicarage garden, sipping lemon barley water as the light faded. She looked thoughtful, her hands still, her eyes half closed. "She was not well liked," said Reverend Sims, sitting beside her, "but she was respected. A woman like Honoria. She carried grudges the way others carry handbags." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "but I rather think she was afraid. The way she clutched that shawl, and her voice when she argued. With Mr. Ashcombe, not just angry, desperate. You think someone frightened her. I think someone gave her reason to change her will, and then reason to silence her." The Reverend looked uneasy. Miss Marple didn't answer at once. She watched the evening star emerge over the hedgerow. "I once knew a woman," she said at last, "who baked jam tarts for her invalid brother every morning. Never missed a day. Then, quite suddenly, she gave them to the dog instead. Everyone thought it strange. The truth, of course, was that she'd grown tired of the poison not working." The Reverend stared. "Are you suggesting—" "I suggest nothing," Miss Marple said serenely, rising with the help of her walking stick. "I merely observe, and I've observed that murder, when it comes to a village, is never as strange as people pretend. It's quite like mildew, you know. It thrives where secrets are kept in damp corners." She turned toward the gate, her silhouette slender against the last blush of sunset. There were more people to speak with, more threads to follow. A will had vanished. A woman had died. And in the midst of it all, the garden still bloomed. But Miss Marple, quietly, had already begun to tug at the edges of the fabric. And something, somewhere, was beginning to unravel. The next morning brought a soft drizzle to Netherdine, veiling the village in a quiet melancholy. The flag above the post office flew at half-mast, and gossip, muffled by the rain, trickled along the hedgerows like water through old gutters. At Fern Hollow, the atmosphere was subdued. The staff, all of whom had been questioned by Inspector Craddock, kept to their duties with lowered voices and wary glances. Mrs. Braithwaite, the housekeeper of 20 years, had taken to carrying her rosary in her apron pocket, murmuring prayers, between polishing the brass knobs and monitoring the tea trays. It was she who had discovered something that morning, something she hesitated to share, but which, with visible reluctance, she had finally passed to the inspector. Craddock sat in the late widow's study, his coat still damp from the walk, the fire newly lit to push away the chill. Before him lay a bundle of charred papers found in the garden incinerator, still faintly warm. Pages of fine stationery, partially burned, the edges blackened and curling inward. A few words had survived, most had not, but one phrase in bold, black ink and unmistakably Honoria's distinctive scrawl, had withstood the flames. Revoke all previous wills and testaments. Craddock frowned as he stared at the singed document. Someone tried to destroy it, he muttered. Sloppy work. Miss Marple sat opposite, her knitting needles at rest in her lap. Her expression was mild, but her eyes were fixed on the ruined parchment. Sloppy, yes, she agreed, but rushed perhaps. It suggests panic, or at least a lack of time. And desperation makes people careless. Craddock glanced up. Still no sign of the latest will. Miss Marple shook her head. Not as such. But I wonder, might there be more than one draft? Mr. Ashcombe said he was to collect the final version, did he not? It stands to reason there may have been earlier copies. One doesn't compose a new will over tea and jam, you know. It takes thought, revision, resolve. Craddock leaned back, in the chair, with a sigh. This case has too many shadows, Miss Marple. Every servant in this house adored the Colonel and merely tolerated his wife. The nephew had motive. Even Ashcombe might have had something to gain if she'd bequeathed the estate in trust, say. Or if she threatened to remove his services, Miss Marple mused. Solicitors are not always purely decorative, but they can be quite sensitive about their roles. Craddock narrowed his eyes. You think Ashcombe? I think Mr. Ashcombe was troubled, but not, I suspect, homicidal. Still, it's curious. His expression when he read that letter, more confusion than grief, as if the content surprised him. Just then, the door opened, and Constable Hartley entered, removing his cap with damp fingers. Sir, he said, there's a visitor. Miss Edwina Vale. Says she was a companion to Mrs. Cranley last year. She's heard the news and insists on speaking with you. Craddock and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. Send her in, Craddock said. A few moments later, Edwina Vale entered. A woman of about 40, angular in frame and plainly dressed, with eyes like a birdwatcher's, sharp, patient, and quietly judgmental. She nodded respectfully to the inspector, but it was to Miss Marple her gaze turned with recognition. You must be Miss Marple, she said. Mrs. Cranley spoke of you often. Did she now? Miss Marple asked, feigning surprise. Yes. She found you unsettling, I think. Said you saw things you weren't supposed to. Miss Marple chuckled. I'm afraid I never quite learned the polite art of not noticing. Edwina folded her hands. I left my position at Fern Hollow. Nearly 10 months ago. I wasn't dismissed precisely, more eased out. Mrs. Cranley became increasingly suspicious. She thought people were scheming against her. Paranoia? Craddock asked. Edwina hesitated. Perhaps, but not entirely without cause. She knew someone was watching her. She said as much more than once. Letters were missing. Jewelry moved. She kept her will locked in her sewing cabinet, but even then she fretted that it had been tampered with. Did she say who she suspected? Miss Marple asked. Edwina pressed her lips together. She never said so outright, but I noticed she was very careful around Howard and around her maid, Lillian. Craddock looked up from his notes. Lillian? Partridge? Yes, she's cleverer than she seems, always eavesdropping at doors. And she had an odd hold over Mrs. Cranley, was able to calm her fits when no one else could. I once caught her reading Mrs. Cranley's correspondence. She pretended she was dusting, Craddock wrote quickly. Thank you, Miss Vale. You've been very helpful. After she left, Miss Marple rose slowly, her fingers curling around the handle of her handbag. Inspector, I believe it's time I had a quiet word with Lillian, if you don't mind. Craddock gave her a long look. Go. Ahead. But don't push her too hard. She's squirrely. Miss Marple found Lillian in the linen room, folding sheets with exaggerated care. A thin girl with shifty eyes and a nervous smile, she jumped when Miss Marple stepped inside. Oh, I didn't hear you come in. That's quite all right. Dear, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I always found laundry work soothing. The rhythm of it, rather like knitting. Lillian gave a tight smile. Yes, ma'am. Miss Marple examined a folded sheet with interest. Tell me, Lillian, were you in the house the day before Mrs. Cranley died? I was, she said quickly. I brought up her cocoa. She hadn't eaten well. I think she knew something was wrong. Did she mention anything about the will? Lillian hesitated, pressing a crease flat with unusual force. Only that she was changing it. Said she was tired of being taken advantage of. Said she was going to settle it once and for all. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And did she mention what she intended to do with the new one? A beat. Then Lillian looked down at the sheet in her hands. She said she was going to post it. She was afraid someone might get to it if she kept it in the house. She even addressed the envelope herself, brown paper and wax seal. Said she'd take it to the postbox herself after the party. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. But she didn't, did she? No. Lillian swallowed. She said she wasn't feeling well and left it in the hall to be posted in the evening. But then she went to rest and it vanished. Lillian nodded. Miss Marple gave her an encouraging smile. Thank you, Lillian. That's been most illuminating. As she left the linen room, Miss Marple's mind moved swiftly. The seal on the envelope she had found the day before, it hadn't been addressed at all. Meant to look like the one Mrs. Cranley had prepared, perhaps, planted to confuse. Outside, the rain had ceased, and a watery sun struggled through the clouds. She made her way toward the village postbox, passing the ivy-covered lane that led to the vicarage. She paused beside the red cast-iron box. Its paint was chipped. A rusted hinge clung stubbornly to its flap. A curl of brown paper poked from the edge. She drew it out carefully. Her fingers, practiced and sure, smoothed the damp surface. The address, Bernard Ashcombe, Escaros, confidential, to be opened upon my death. Miss Marple's breath caught. Not destroyed, not burned, hidden, not lost by accident but concealed by someone who feared its contents. And now, at last, Miss Marple knew precisely where to begin looking for a motive strong enough to kill. There was more than inheritance at stake. Far more. And somewhere in the pleasant little web of Netherdine, the spider had begun to stir. Miss Marple slipped the envelope carefully into her handbag and turned back toward the village street. The damp air carried the scent of earth and freshly mown grass, a sharp contrast to the stale, uneasy atmosphere that clung to Fern Hollow since Honoria's death. As she walked, the wheels of her mind began turning, sorting through details and weighing each against the others like delicate pieces of a puzzle. The postbox, though now empty, had not seen the arrival of any letter matching the one she held. Whoever had taken it, if it had ever been posted at all, had done so with clear intent. Miss Marple thought of Lillian's words. The will was meant to be sent after the garden party, but the envelope was found in the house, never posted. Someone must have intercepted it, but who? At the village square, chatter had gathered among the market stalls and the general store, where villagers whispered in cautious tones. Miss Marple recognized the patterns already, each person holding fragments of truth and layers of bias, each eager to place blame elsewhere. But to her, this murmuring chorus was merely a backdrop, a familiar murmur over which she could focus her sharper senses. Her first call was to the vicarage, where Reverend Sims awaited news. The vicar greeted her with a grave nod, indicating the modest sitting room where they could talk in quiet. "Have you any new insights, Miss Marple?" he asked. "Perhaps," she answered, "but the situation grows more complex. There is a missing will, and that worries me. The document I found was charred, but an untouched copy was concealed right under our noses." Sims frowned. "A copy hidden where?" "Not hidden yet, but the envelope with the supposed final will was kept within the house, intended for posting, but never left." Someone took it or hid it. And from Lillian's account, Honoria feared her documents would be tampered with. Vicar's eyebrows lifted. That certainly suggests motive for foul play. If the will changed suddenly, someone's inheritance or reputation might be at stake. Indeed. And that leads me to ask, who benefits from keeping the will as it was, or altering it? We have Mr. Ashcombe, the solicitor, whose services might be under threat. There is Howard Green, the nephew, who was notably excluded from recent events. And of course, the household staff, some of whom seem to have secrets of their own. The Reverend sighed. Small villages have a way of hiding deep resentments beneath polite smiles. Miss Marple smiled softly. That is why I find them so endlessly fascinating. Later, she sought out Bernard Ashcombe, who had been spending much of his time in his modest office above the village shop. The man was pale and restless, his dark eyes rimmed with tiredness. "Miss Marple," he said as she entered, "I hardly know what to say. I find the whole affair distressing and, frankly, embarrassing to have my name dragged through the mud by insinuations." "I understand your discomfort," she said gently, "but the truth will always come out. I'm curious, when did you last see the will?" Ashcombe rubbed his hands together. "Yesterday morning, I believe. Mrs. Cranley summoned me to discuss some final alterations. She was more irritable than usual, muttering about old ghosts and breaking the chain." "Did she speak about those ghosts?" "A few vague remarks. Something about family betrayals and debts not yet paid. I confess I found it rather theatrical. But then, Mrs. Cranley had a flair for drama in her later years." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him. "Did you sense—" She feared for her safety. Ashcombe hesitated. "I think so. She said once that the village wasn't as peaceful as it seemed. I thought she was merely lonely. Lonely or hunted. There is a difference." Ashcombe looked away. "You think I had something to do with it?" "No," she said firmly. "But I think your relationship with Honoria was more complicated than you let on." He sighed. "It was. She was a difficult woman. I tried to serve her best interests, but she mistrusted even me." As Miss Marple took her leave, she noticed a thin scar along his wrist, half hidden beneath his cuff. A small detail, but oddly out of place on a man who prided himself on neatness. She filed it away for future consideration. Next, Miss Marple made her way to the village pub, the Queen's Head, where Howard Green was known to take refuge from questions. She found him at a corner table, nursing a glass of sherry, his expression guarded but not hostile. "Mr. Green," she said pleasantly, sliding into the seat opposite him. "It's a difficult time for you, I'm sure. I was hoping to understand your relationship with your aunt a little better." Howard's jaw tightened. She was my only family. And yet, in her final years, she seemed to have forgotten me. Perhaps I wasn't the nephew she hoped for. Or perhaps you were a disappointment. He laughed bitterly. "You could say that. I made mistakes, financial ones. I was counting on her support to recover, but the more she withdrew it, the harder I pushed." Miss Marple leaned in. "What sort of support did you expect?" "A place at Fern Hollow. Money, connections," she promised. Then she changed her mind. "I suspect that's why she rewrote the will." "And yet, you claim you were not in the village on the day she died." "No, I was not. I was at the London Club. Several can vouch for me." Miss Marple studied him quietly. "Alibis can be fragile things." Howard's eyes darkened. "I'm not a murderer, Miss Marple, but I wouldn't mind a little justice." The conversation was interrupted by the pub door opening, admitting a blast of damp air and a woman's voice calling out. It was Lillian Partridge, her face pale and drawn. She caught sight of Miss Marple and hurried over. "Miss Marple, I need to speak with you. It's about Mrs. Cranley." Miss Marple nodded. "Come, let us find somewhere private." In a quiet corner, Lillian's voice dropped to a whisper. There's something I didn't say before. On the night of the garden party, I saw someone near the garden shed. I thought it was the gardener, but the figure moved oddly. I didn't get a good look. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Did you recognize this person? No, but I heard voices arguing, low and sharp. One voice was Mrs. Cranley's, the other, male. Did you hear what was said? No, only fragments. Something about the will, betrayal, and you can't keep it hidden. Then the door slammed. Miss Marple's mind raced. A secret meeting, a heated argument, a threat. It fit with the growing picture. Someone desperate enough to kill to control the will. Thank you, Lillian. You've been very brave. Lillian nodded, eyes shining with unshed tears. I just want the truth. As she left, Miss Marple turned her gaze to the window. The rain now a mere memory. The threads were drawing taut, and the quiet village of Netherdine was ready to reveal its hidden shadows. She knew the next steps would be delicate. Confrontations cloaked in civility, questions asked with the gentlest of hands. For beneath the veneer of calm, the restless currents of fear and greed pulsed strong, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming smile and keen eye, was prepared to follow them wherever they might lead. The afternoon waned as Miss Marple returned to Fern Hollow, the great house standing solemn against a sky streaked with pale gold and heavy clouds. The events of the day had layered themselves in her mind like the gathering shadows on the lawn, each detail folding into the next, subtle but undeniable. Inside, the atmosphere was taut. The household moved with quiet urgency, footsteps careful, voices lowered to cautious murmurs. The inspector had departed for the station with a list of names to question further, but the pulse of suspicion lingered palpably. Miss Marple paused in the entrance hall, noting the polished surfaces, the gleam of fine woodwork still unmarred by the weight of tragedy, yet somehow hollowed by it. She was thinking of the argument Lillian had overheard, the male voice, the garden shed, the shadows of the night. It was a key, subtle and almost invisible, but unmistakable. She set off toward the garden shed, a small weather-beaten building, nestled behind a hedge of overgrown laurels, its door hanging slightly ajar. The scent of damp earth and cut grass rose as she approached, mingling with the faint tang of oil and rust. Inside, tools hung in orderly fashion, but a spade lay on the floor, its handle smeared with something dark. Miss Marple bent down, inspecting the handle carefully. The dark marks were fresh, dried mud, or something more. She sniffed delicately. It was earth, but oddly, it carried the faintest trace of something metallic beneath. A faint bloodstain, perhaps. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice behind her. Miss Marple, I wouldn't be touching that if I were you. She turned to see Howard Green, stepping cautiously through the hedge. His face was drawn, eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but alert. I thought you might be here, he said. I wanted to see if there was anything I could do. Miss Marple gestured toward the spade. Care to explain this? Howard glanced down, lips tightening. That's the gardener's spade. He said he'd left it outside after clearing some weeds near the shed. Did you see him that night? Howard shook his head. No, I wasn't near the garden then. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And yet someone was. Howard swallowed. Look, Miss Marple, I don't like how things are turning. Everyone's looking at me as if I'm guilty because I wanted my aunt's money. But I swear I didn't harm her. She studied him a moment, then said quietly, You understand that appearances can be misleading. But the truth always comes. Through? Howard nodded, a flicker of hope passing over his features. I want the truth too. Leaving Howard by the shed, Miss Marple made her way to the servants' quarters, where Lillian Partridge was waiting anxiously. The girl's hands trembled as she wrung a handkerchief, her eyes darting about. Lillian, Did you see anyone else near the garden that evening? Anyone unusual? She shook her head. No, ma'am. Only the gardener left late, as usual. Miss Marple hesitated. Is there something you're not telling me? Lillian bit her lip. There was someone else, a stranger, but I was too afraid to say. I thought it might be nothing. Miss Marple's interest piqued. Describe this stranger. Lillian's eyes widened. Tall, dark coat, hat pulled low. I only caught a glimpse as he slipped past the kitchen window. Miss Marple's mind raced. A stranger in a quiet village was as unusual as a summer snow. Did anyone else see this person? No one else said anything. I was afraid to speak. Miss Marple smiled gently. Thank you, dear. Your courage will not be forgotten. Later that evening, as the village lights twinkled on, Miss Marple sat by the fire in the drawing room, the envelope containing the hidden will resting on her lap. The door creaked open and Inspector Craddock entered, carrying a small leather-bound notebook. Miss Marple, he said, settling into a chair. I've been going over the statements from the staff and neighbours. Several have mentioned a visitor the day before the murder, a man asking questions about the Cranley estate. No one knew his name and he left before the party. Curious, Miss Marple mused. A man seeking information, lurking in the wings. Craddock nodded. I've also heard from the village postmaster that a letter matching the description of the will was handed in at the postbox late that evening, after the time Mrs. Cranley was supposedly resting. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. So, the will was sent after all, apparently. But it never reached Mr. Ashcombe. The postmaster's clerk disappeared with it. A young lad, new to the job, unreliable. Miss Marple pursed her lips. That changes the picture. The will was deliberately intercepted. Craddock grunted. And the question remains, by whom? We have suspects with motive. Ashcombe, the nephew, even the staff. But none have opportunity, without drawing suspicion. Except for the stranger, Miss Marple said softly. Or the mysterious young post clerk. Craddock frowned. I'm sending for the boy to be found. Miss Marple nodded. Good. And meanwhile, I intend to pay a visit to the post office myself. Before they could rise, a sudden knock startled them. The door opened, revealing Edwina Vale, the former companion. I couldn't stay away, she said breathlessly. I found something. In the village library, an old letter from Honoria Cranley, addressed to no one, but hidden inside a book on local history. Miss Marple took the letter gently, unfolding the yellowed paper. The handwriting was firm, the ink faded but legible. They think me fragile and forgetful, but I see their games, the debts, the secrets, the lies. If anything happens to me, the truth will be in the papers I keep, hidden well. Trust no one, not even those closest. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. The plot thickens. Edwina looked at the two inquiring faces. I believe Mrs. Cranley knew her life was in danger. She was protecting herself. Craddock stood, a new determination in his eyes. Then it's time we found those papers. Miss Marple rose, placing the letter in her handbag alongside the hidden will. Indeed. For only in uncovering those secrets will we find the real murderer and bring peace to this troubled house. Outside, the village of Netherdine settled into night, unaware that beneath its quiet surface, the true story was just beginning to unfold. The morning dawned grey and overcast, casting a sombre light over Netherdine. Miss Marple and Inspector Didier Craddock left the warmth of Fern Hollow behind as they made their way toward the village library, the letter from Honoria a quiet weight in her handbag. The streets were still, save for a few early risers and the distant clatter of a cart. Inside the library, a venerable building of stone and ivy, the musty scent of aging paper mingled with dust. The librarian, Mrs. Pennington, a thin woman with sharp eyes behind round spectacles, greeted them with a nervous smile. Miss Marple, Inspector, How may I assist you today? We are here regarding a letter found among your collection. Miss Marple began, producing the folded sheet. Mrs. Vale discovered it hidden inside a book on local history. Mrs. Pennington's eyes narrowed slightly as she took the letter and read it carefully. That is very unusual, she murmured. I keep a strict order here. Nothing should be out of place. Perhaps someone placed it deliberately, Craddock suggested. Or perhaps Mrs. Cranley herself, Miss Marple said softly. She knew something. They began to search through the local history section, guided by the librarian's careful hand and Miss Marple's sharp eye. The book in which the letter was found was titled The Secrets of Netherdine, an old volume chronicling the village's past. Miss Marple gently turned the pages, noting some scribbled marginalia, names, dates, cryptic notes. As she scanned the text, a small folded paper slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. Bending down, she retrieved it. The handwriting was familiar, the same as on the letter. It was a list of names with annotations beside each: debts, betrayals, grievances, and warnings. Some names were crossed out, others circled in red ink. At the bottom, a single word stood out: beware. This is significant, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Cranley had enemies in this village, and she knew who they were. Craddock looked troubled. This complicates the investigation. It means the motive runs deeper than mere inheritance. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. The roots of the crime lie in old wounds. As they pored over the papers, a sudden knock on the library door interrupted their concentration. Lillian Partridge entered, her face pale but determined. Miss Marple, Inspector, I thought you might want to see this, she said, holding out a small notebook. It belonged to the postmaster's clerk who vanished the night the will was supposed to be sent. Miss Marple took the notebook with interest. The pages were filled with hurried notes, names and times, scribbled with a restless hand. One entry caught her attention. Saw Mr. Ashcombe near the postbox after dark. He seemed nervous, talked to a stranger briefly. She looked up at Lillian. Where did you find this? In his room. After he disappeared, I was looking for anything that might help. Inspector Craddock frowned. So Ashcombe was at the postbox the night the will was intercepted. It seems so, Miss Marple mused. And he spoke with someone unknown to the village. The threads were tightening. Miss Marple's mind raced to piece them together. Ashcombe's nervousness, the stranger in the dark, the intercepted will, the hidden list of enemies, a web of deception spun carefully to conceal the truth. We need to find this stranger, Craddock said. If he's involved, he could be the key. Miss Marple nodded. But who is he? And what does he want with the Cranley estate? The questions hung in the air as they left the library. Outside, the village was waking fully now, the hum of daily life resuming as if nothing had happened. But beneath the surface, Miss Marple knew, secrets were shifting, and the truth was drawing closer. Their next stop was the post office, a small, stone building on the corner of the village green. Mrs. Harper, the elderly postmistress, greeted them with a wary smile. Good morning, Miss Marple, Inspector. I hope you're not here to cause trouble. Not at all, Miss Marple said kindly. We're just hoping you might help with some questions about a letter. Mrs. Harper's eyes flickered. I might remember something. It's been a busy time, you see. Miss Marple noticed a faint tremor in the woman's hands as she led them behind the counter. Did a young clerk recently leave your employ? Someone new and perhaps not quite reliable? Mrs. Harper nodded reluctantly. Yes, young Thomas. Came in last month. Didn't last long. Took off without warning. Did he ever mention receiving a letter from Fern Hollow? Craddock asked. The postmistress considered. I recall him bringing in a thick envelope one evening late, said it was urgent. It was. I posted it the next morning, but the boy disappeared before then. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Do you remember if he mentioned anyone unusual? Someone who might have given him instructions? Mrs. Harper hesitated. He was secretive. Said he couldn't trust anyone. I think he was frightened. That's telling, Miss Marple said softly. Someone must have pressured him. Just then, a commotion at the door drew their attention. A tall, well-dressed man entered, his presence commanding the room. His eyes swept over Miss Marple and the inspector, landing on Mrs. Harper. "I'm looking for Thomas," he announced, voice low but firm. "Has anyone seen him?" Mrs. Harper paled. I haven't." The man's gaze lingered on Miss Marple. "And you are?" "Someone who prefers to observe quietly," she replied. With a slight smile, "May I ask your name?" The man hesitated before answering. "Gideon Marlowe. I represent certain interests regarding the Cranley estate." Miss Marple felt the shift immediately. A ripple of tension, a subtle but unmistakable challenge. Here was a man with purpose, possibly a player in the dangerous game unfolding. "I suggest," she said gently, "that you have much to learn before you make assumptions. The truth is seldom found in haste." Marlowe's eyes gleamed with a mixture of amusement and warning. "Perhaps, Miss Marple, but time is a luxury few of us can afford." He turned abruptly and left, leaving behind an air charged with intent. As the door closed behind him, Craddock muttered, "He's trouble." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and I suspect he knows more than he lets on." Outside, the rain began again, soft at first, then steady. Miss Marple wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her thoughts a whirl of connections and possibilities. The missing will, the intercepted letter, the list of enemies, the shadowy stranger, and now this enigmatic Mr. Marlowe, all threads tangled into a complex tapestry. Somewhere in the village lay the key to unlock it all, but time was running out. Miss Marple glanced toward Fern Hollow, its windows dark against the stormy sky. She would return there soon, to search again, to watch and to listen. For in the quiet moments, the hidden truth would reveal itself, and justice would be served. With a final look at the rain-soaked village, she stepped forward, ready to follow the trail wherever it might lead. The rain continued to fall in steady sheets, drumming a somber rhythm on the windows of Fern Hollow as Miss Marple settled into her favourite armchair by the fire. The flickering flames cast soft shadows that danced across the walls, but despite the warmth, an undercurrent of chill lingered in the room, an echo of the unsettled mysteries that clung to the household like a mist. Outside, the storm blurred the edges of the garden, making the familiar hedges and flower beds seem strange and secretive, as if hiding whispers beneath the wet leaves. Miss Marple's thoughts, too, drifted through the tangled strands of the case, weaving the threads into a fabric that was just beginning to show its true pattern. A soft knock interrupted the quiet. She looked up to see Lillian Partridge, clutching the small notebook she had found days before. Her face was pale but resolute. "Miss Marple," she said hesitantly, "there's something else I found in the house. Something I think you should see." Intrigued, Miss Marple invited her closer, and Lillian opened the notebook to reveal a series of letters tucked between the pages. The paper was fragile, the ink faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Honoria Cranley's. "These were hidden in her dressing-table drawer," Lillian explained. "I only found them after Mrs. Vale mentioned the letter in the library." Miss Marple carefully unfolded the letters, reading aloud the first few lines. "My dearest friend, if you receive this, it means that danger has found me. I have discovered a secret about the family that some would kill to protect. You must promise to watch carefully, to listen to what is said between the lines." As she read on, the letters revealed a story of suspicion, whispered betrayals, and a growing fear for her safety. Honoria wrote of a hidden ledger, records of debts and payments, bribes and blackmail, that threatened to unravel the very foundations of the Cranley legacy. Someone feared exposure, Miss Marple murmured, and that fear was powerful, enough to silence her. But who? Lillian's voice trembled. Miss Marple looked up, eyes steady. That is what we must discover. Later that afternoon, the inspector arrived with news. The young post clerk, Thomas, had been found. His whereabouts a nearby village where he had been hiding since his disappearance. He was nervous, but willing to speak, and they planned to visit him at once. Miss Marple and Craddock made their way through the winding lanes, the countryside damp and heavy with the scent of wet earth and moss. At a small cottage, they found Thomas sitting by a dim hearth, his hands trembling as he offered tea. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," he said quickly. "I was scared. Mr. Marlowe came to me, said he could help with money if I did what?" he asked. "What did he ask you to do?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. "Intercept the letter from Mrs. Cranley's house," Thomas admitted. "He said it was important, and that if the wrong people got it, there'd be trouble." "Did you know what was in the letter?" Craddock asked. Thomas shook his head. "No. I just did what I was told." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "So Mr. Marlowe has been manipulating people to cover his tracks?" "Yes," Thomas said. "And I'm sorry." She patted his hand reassuringly. "Thank you for your honesty. It will help bring the truth to light." Returning to Fern Hollow, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. The threads were converging. The intercepted letter, the hidden ledger, the shadowy Mr. Marlowe, each piece revealing a darker pattern beneath the village's peaceful surface. That evening, as the household gathered for dinner, the atmosphere was tense. Whispers followed each step, and eyes avoided each other's. Miss Marple observed quietly, noting the subtle shifts in behavior, the nervous glance of Edward Ashcombe, the strained smile of Edwina Vale, the watchful gaze of Howard Green. After dinner, she requested a moment alone with Craddock. In the dimly lit drawing room, she laid out the pieces of the puzzle as she saw them. "Mrs. Cranley feared exposure of her family's secrets," she began. "She hid the ledger, the record of debts and betrayals. Someone, Mr. Marlowe, I believe, sought to suppress this information to protect their interests." Craddock nodded. "And Ashcombe's presence near the post box, the intercepted letter, it all points to a desperate attempt to control the narrative. But the motive is more than money," Miss Marple said slowly. "It is about power, reputation, and long-buried guilt." They agreed to search Fern Hollow once more, this time focusing on the places Mrs. Cranley might have concealed the ledger. The drawing room, the study, the library, each was examined with care. In the study, behind a loose panel of woodwork near the fireplace, they found a small, dust-covered box. Inside lay a stack of papers. The ledger, meticulously kept, chronicling years of clandestine dealings and names that sent ripples through Miss Marple's mind. As they studied the ledger, a knock on the door interrupted them. Howard Green entered, his face pale but determined. "I need to speak with you," he said urgently. Miss Marple gestured for him to sit. Howard's voice trembled as he confessed to overhearing a conversation between Marlowe and Ashcombe. The night before the murder, a heated argument about money, threats made, and a plan to prevent the will from coming to light. The pieces fit together now, a conspiracy born of greed, betrayal, and fear, culminating in the silencing of Honoria Cranley. "Miss," Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction, "we have what we need." But even as the truth began to surface, she knew that the final test lay ahead, subtle, psychological, and carefully planned. The murderer would reveal themselves not through force, but through the smallest of cracks in their carefully constructed facade. The village of Netherdine would never be the same. But justice, like the steady rain outside, would cleanse the stains of deceit, one drop at a time. The following morning arrived cloaked in mist, the village of Netherdine waking slowly, under a grey sky that seemed to press close to the earth. Miss Marple stood by the kitchen window at Fern Hollow, her gaze wandering across the garden where droplets clung like tiny jewels to the rose bushes and ivy. The atmosphere was heavy, as if the village itself was holding its breath. In the drawing room, Inspector Craddock was already seated, reviewing his notes, his brow furrowed in concentration. Miss Marple approached quietly, placing the ledger gently on the table between them. "We have much to consider today," she said softly. Craddock looked up, meeting her steady eyes. "Indeed. With the ledger in our possession and Howard Green's account, the case is clearer, but still incomplete." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, the documents speak of debts, blackmail and grudges, but the act itself, the murder, was a moment of desperate passion or cold calculation." They shared a thoughtful silence until a knock interrupted. It was Edwina Vale, her expression tense but polite. "Miss Marple, Inspector, may I join you? There are questions I must ask." Miss Marple gestured to a chair. "Of course, Edwina, we were just discussing the case." Edwina seated herself, her fingers clasped tightly. "I've been thinking about the ledger and the accusations it holds. If someone in the village feared its exposure so greatly, then any of us could be implicated. But I wonder, have we considered the motives of those closest to Honoria? Those who stood to gain or lose the most from her passing?" The inspector gave a slow nod. "It's a point well made." Miss Marple, too, considered Edwina's words. "Often," she said thoughtfully, "those closest have the deepest secrets. It is the nature of human relationships, complex, layered, and sometimes fraught with hidden resentments." Edwina's eyes met hers. "I understand, Miss Marple, and I must confess there are things about Honoria's past and ours that I have only recently begun to question." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Howard Green, his manner cautious yet determined. "I hope to speak with you all again. Since our last talk, I've found myself unable to rest." He hesitated before continuing. "There was something I overheard during that conversation between Marlowe and Ashcombe that I failed to mention before." Everyone leaned in as Howard described a brief but telling remark, a reference to a final step that would ensure no evidence surfaced, a clean end to the matter of the will. Miss Marple's eyes glinted with understanding. "A final step, a premeditated act to silence a threat." Craddock sighed, rubbing his temples. "It seems we are dealing with a killer who planned carefully, who anticipated investigation." Miss Marple stood and moved toward the window, her gaze fixed on the distant hills cloaked in mist. This final step must be what separates the obvious suspect, Ashcombe, from the true murderer. Turning back, she addressed the group with quiet resolve. "We must test those who stand to gain the most from Mrs. Cranley's silence, but in a way that reveals the truth without alerting them." Edwina's brow furrowed. "How do you propose to do that?" Miss Marple smiled, faintly. "Through observation and a subtle psychological game. The guilty will slip in their composure. The innocent will remain steady." She then asked Howard, "Would you help me arrange a gathering, perhaps a small dinner, where we might observe reactions and listen carefully?" Howard agreed readily, and preparations began swiftly. The gathering would be held at Fern Hollow that very evening, an intimate circle under the guise of mourning and reflection. As the day wore on, the villagers moved about their routines, though a palpable tension simmered beneath their polite facades. Whispers travelled quickly, and eyes darted nervously as the impending meeting drew near. Miss Marple spent the afternoon in quiet reflection, reviewing the ledger once more, memorizing names and notes, preparing herself to watch the human mind as closely as she did any clue. When evening finally came, the guests gathered in the drawing room, the fire casting warm light on faces shadowed by worry. Present were Edward Ashcombe, Edwina Vale, Howard Green, Gideon Marlowe and Lillian Partridge, alongside Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock. The conversation began with polite, measured tones, a careful dance of words as each person sought to maintain composure. Miss Marple listened intently, noting slight shifts in posture, changes in voice, and the fleeting expressions that betrayed inner turmoil. Marlowe was his usual controlled self, though occasionally a flicker of impatience surfaced. Ashcombe appeared guarded, his eyes occasionally darting toward the door, while Edwina maintained a calm exterior, though her fingers twitched nervously. Howard's confession weighed heavily in the air, lending a somber undertone to the evening. Miss Marple initiated gentle inquiries, weaving questions about Honoria's last days and the contents of the ledger, careful to observe reactions rather than provoke defences. When the subject turned to the will and its sudden change, Marlowe's expression darkened ever so slightly. A shadow passed over his face as he leaned forward. It is unfortunate that greed can so easily corrupt. At this, Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Indeed, Mr. Marlowe, but sometimes greed is masked by respectability and a veneer of concern. Marlowe's gaze flickered, but he said nothing further. The conversation shifted to the relationships between the villagers and Mrs. Cranley. Edwina spoke of her long-standing friendship, the confidences shared, but Miss Marple detected a guardedness beneath the surface. Ashcombe offered little, but when pressed gently by Craddock about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, he faltered, his voice tightening. Throughout, Miss Marple's eyes watched, but it was Lillian Partridge who caught her attention most. The young woman appeared increasingly uncomfortable, her fingers nervously twisting a handkerchief. Later, Miss Marple approached her quietly. "Lillian, you seem troubled. Is there something you wish to share?" Lillian's breath caught. I heard voices that night, Miss Marple. Raised voices near the garden. I didn't want to get involved, but now—" "Tell me everything," Miss Marple encouraged gently. Lillian described a heated argument between Marlowe and Ashcombe, words like ruin and desperate exchanged. Then she spoke of a third voice, a softer one, that tried to calm them, but was abruptly silenced. Miss Marple's mind raced. A third party involved, silenced by force or fear. She shared this with Craddock, who immediately resolved to investigate further. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple took a moment alone. By the window, the village lights twinkling through the mist. Her thoughts turned inward, piecing together the human nature behind the crime, the fears, the ambitions, the desperate measures taken in shadows. The final test was at hand, but she knew that the truth, once uncovered, would not only solve a murder, but reveal the fragile and intricate tapestry of human frailty woven through Netherdine. And so, with quiet determination, she prepared to watch closely, to listen keenly, and to catch the smallest slip, the silent confession waiting patiently to be discovered. The early hours of the morning found Fern Hollow shrouded in a thick fog that muffled the world outside and lent a quiet solemnity to the house. Miss Marple sat near the window in her sitting room. The soft ticking of the clock and the faint crackle of the dying fire, the only sounds to accompany her thoughts. The night's gathering had offered subtle clues, but no clear answers yet. What was certain was that beneath the polite veneer of the villagers lay a maze of secrets and deceptions. As dawn crept through the mist, there came a knock at the door. It was Inspector Craddock, his face more grave than usual. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside, "there's been another development." Her eyes lifted immediately. "Do tell." Craddock pulled a small, folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and handed it to her. "This was left at the constable's office during the night. No signature, just these words. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully, reading aloud. The ledger's secrets are only the beginning. Beware those who smile too sweetly. A chill ran down her spine. A warning. Someone is unsettled by our progress. Indeed, Craddock agreed, and I fear that this case is far from over. They resolved to intensify their efforts that day, beginning with a visit to Gideon Marlowe's home. The man's composure at the dinner had been impeccable, but Miss Marple's intuition whispered otherwise. Upon arriving at Marlowe's modest but well-kept residence, they were greeted with cautious hospitality. Marlowe's demeanor was calm, but his eyes flickered with unease when questioned about the letter interception and his whereabouts on the night of the murder. "I have nothing to hide," he said smoothly, yet Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his voice. When asked about the final step Howard Green had overheard, Marlowe's facade cracked momentarily. "I meant only that the matter of the will must be settled quietly. No need for scandal." Miss Marple pressed gently. "And yet you seem to fear that someone would go to extreme lengths to prevent that." Marlowe avoided her gaze. "Fear is a dangerous thing, Miss Marple." Returning to Fern Hollow, Miss Marple and Craddock were met by Lillian Partridge, who looked more composed than the previous evening. "There is something I neglected to mention last night," she said, lowering her voice. "After the argument I overheard, I saw Mr. Ashcombe near the garden, pacing restlessly. He appeared to be clutching something, a small bundle wrapped in cloth." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "A bundle, you say? Did you notice what it was?" "No, I was too far to see clearly, but it seemed important." They decided to search Ashcombe's estate with permission, hoping to find whatever it was. The manor was a grand, aging structure filled with heavy curtains and the scent of old wood and leather. Miss Marple's eyes immediately noted the disarray. In the study, papers scattered as if in haste. After a thorough search, they discovered in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards a small, damp bundle. Carefully unwrapping it, they found a collection of letters, correspondence between Honoria Cranley and an unknown correspondent, discussing threats and plans to expose a scandal involving several villagers. Miss Marple's fingers trembled. Slightly as she read one letter aloud, "They will stop at nothing to keep this secret. I fear my life is in danger, but the truth must be known." The plot thickened. There was a wider conspiracy, and the victim had known too much. Back in the drawing room, the group assembled once more. Miss Marple laid the letters on the table. Honoria Cranley was not only fighting for her inheritance, but for justice. Her murder silenced a voice that could have destroyed reputations. Ashcombe's face grew pale. "This is preposterous. I had no idea." Edwina Vale's eyes flashed with anger. "Did any of you know? Were you all part of this terrible secret?" Howard Green remained silent, eyes downcast, while Marlowe's lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple turned to Craddock. "We must proceed with caution. The guilt may lie with those who appeared most innocent." Suddenly, a sharp sound startled everyone, a muffled cry from the corridor. Rushing outside, they found Lillian Partridge standing beside the staircase, pale and trembling. "It's Mrs. Vale," she whispered. "She's collapsed." Edwina was lying on the floor, clutching her chest, her breath shallow. Craddock called for a doctor, while Miss Marple bent over her. "Edwina, can you tell me what's wrong?" she asked gently. Between gasps, Edwina managed to say, "You don't understand. It's not just the ledger. There's something more. A secret about Honoria's death. Someone is trying to stop the truth." As the doctor arrived and tended to Edwina, Miss Marple's mind raced. Whoever was behind this was growing desperate, their carefully constructed facade beginning to crumble. That afternoon, the villagers gathered again, their faces drawn and tense. The storm of suspicion was reaching a climax. Miss Marple stood quietly, watching. The threads of deceit were unraveling, and soon the truth would emerge, not from brute force or loud accusations, but from the subtle slips, the hesitation, the guilt reflected in a glance or a nervous twitch. And in that room, under the weight of unspoken secrets, the real murderer awaited the moment when their carefully guarded deception would finally fail them. The evening settled over Netherdine with a quiet intensity that seemed almost unnatural. In the drawing room of Fern Hollow, the usual warmth of crackling fires and gentle conversation was replaced by a tense silence, each villager caught in their own private turmoil. Edwina Vale had been tended to, and was now resting upstairs, still, pale but stable, her earlier words lingering heavily in the minds of those present. Miss Marple sat comfortably yet alert, her knitting forgotten in her lap as she carefully observed the faces around her. Howard Green sat near the window, staring out at the creeping darkness as though searching for answers in the gathering night. Gideon Marlowe paced slowly by the bookcase, his fingers brushing absently over the spines of worn volumes. Edward Ashcombe remained seated, his posture rigid, eyes fixed on an imaginary point on the carpet. Miss Marple's gaze settled finally on Lillian Partridge, who stood near the doorway, her expression taut with anxiety. There was something about the young woman, perhaps the way she bit her lip, or the nervous flicker in her eyes, that told Miss Marple the evening's revelations had unsettled her more deeply than most. Breaking the silence, Miss Marple spoke. Softly, "There is still much we do not understand, but the pieces are beginning to fall into place. It is clear that Honoria Cranley was entangled in a web far more dangerous than we first suspected." Marlowe halted his pacing and fixed her with a sharp look. "Dangerous? You speak as if she invited it." Miss Marple smiled gently but did not waver. "Sometimes, Mr. Marlowe, the truth is not a matter of invitation but of circumstance. Mrs. Cranley's efforts to bring secrets to light threatened powerful interests, and such threats are often met with severe consequences." Howard Green sighed deeply. "The letters we found show that Honoria feared for her safety, but she did not say who she trusted or who she feared most." Ashcombe leaned forward. "Are you suggesting the murderer is someone here? Among us?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I am. And as the threats grow more desperate, Edwina's collapse being a stark reminder, it is clear that the culprit feels cornered." Edwina, now seated with a cup of tea, looked up, her face pale but determined. "I cannot keep silent. There is a truth I must tell, but I fear the consequences." "Speak freely, Edwina," Miss Marple encouraged. Taking a steadying breath, Edwina revealed, "Honoria confided in me once about a scandal she uncovered years ago, something involving a hidden affair and a financial betrayal that implicated more than one person in this village. She believed that if that secret ever came out, it would ruin reputations and lives." Eyes around the room flickered with unease, but it was Lillian who finally broke the tension. "I overheard more than an argument that night. After Marlowe and Ashcombe left the garden, I saw someone else, a figure I did not recognize. They moved quickly and seemed desperate." "Did you see who it was?" Miss Marple asked gently. Lillian shook her head. "No, but they dropped something small and metallic, near the rose bushes. I didn't dare retrieve it." Without hesitation, Miss Marple rose and retrieved a small hand lantern. "Then we shall search the garden at once. That object may hold the key." Outside, the night air was cold and sharp, the mist thickening under the moon's faint glow. The villagers formed a quiet procession toward the garden, their steps tentative and spirits heavy. Miss Marple moved with practiced care, scanning the ground near the rose bushes. After a few moments, her fingers closed around something cold and hard, a small silver locket, tarnished but intact. She held it up, eyes narrowing. "This belongs to someone here. Perhaps to the person who wished to silence Mrs. Cranley." As the group gathered closer, Miss Marple opened the locket to reveal two tiny portraits. One, unmistakably Honoria Cranley's, the other a young man's face, one not spoken of in village gossip. "The plot thickens," she murmured. "This locket ties Honoria to a hidden relationship, one she kept secret, perhaps to protect someone." Marlowe stepped forward abruptly. "I know that man. It is Samuel Benton, a man who left Netherdine decades ago under scandalous circumstances." Ashcombe frowned. "But why keep such a secret? And why would it lead to murder?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Because secrets of the past have a way of resurfacing, and those who stand to lose everything will do anything to keep them buried." The tension thickened as Miss Marple laid out the growing web of motives, old grudges, betrayals, hidden loves, and financial ruin. The ledger, the letters, the collapsed Edwina, and now the locket, all pieces of a puzzle demanding resolution. Back. Inside, as the fire flickered low, Miss Marple proposed a final test, one designed to unmask the killer through the subtle art of psychological pressure. She suggested they recount Honoria's last days, each guest asked to share their memories and feelings. But carefully, she would watch their reactions, their slips, and their silences. One by one, they spoke. Marlowe recounted their last meeting with a calm precision. Howard Green's voice trembled slightly as he spoke of his suspicions. Edwina's recount was heartfelt, but guarded. When it came to Ashcombe, however, the atmosphere shifted. His hands clenched tightly and a faint flush crept up his neck. Miss Marple asked softly, "Mr. Ashcombe, did you know about Honoria's secret relationship with Samuel Benton?" A long pause followed. Finally, Ashcombe whispered, "I did. I was told years ago, but I swore to keep it quiet." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "And yet, when the ledger and the letters threatened to reveal everything, your calmness faltered." Ashcombe's eyes darted to the door, then back. "I wanted to protect the village's reputation." "But at what cost?" Miss Marple asked, gently. Suddenly, from the shadows, Lillian spoke, her voice trembling. "I think it was you, Mr. Ashcombe. You feared the truth would ruin you, just as much as anyone else." The room seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The truth once uncovered is seldom kind, but justice must be served." As the night deepened, the threads woven by lies and fear began to unravel, and the silent confession waiting beneath the surface edged closer to the light. As the quiet of the night deepened, Fern Hollow's drawing room felt charged with an unspoken tension. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the faces before her, each etched with uncertainty, fear, and guilt in varying degrees. The scattered pieces of the puzzle laid bare in careful order now demanded a final fitting. It was time for the truth to emerge. Miss Marple rose slowly, her voice soft but resolute. "We have seen the threads of this mystery entwined tightly around hidden motives, old betrayals, and carefully kept secrets. But the pattern is clearer now." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. The murderer is someone who had much to lose, not only their reputation, but their control over the truth and future of Netherdine. Her gaze settled on Edward Ashcombe. "You, Mr. Ashcombe, have tried to protect the village's name, but in doing so, you silenced the very voice calling for justice." He stiffened, the faintest flicker of panic flashing in his eyes. "Why?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Was it fear, pride, or a desperate need to keep a scandal buried?" Ashcombe's composure cracked, and he sank into a chair. "It was everything. Honoria discovered the affair and Benton's plans to expose the ledger's contents. She threatened to go public. I feared the ruin it would bring, to families, to businesses, to the village itself." "Did you meet her the night she died?" Craddock pressed. Ashcombe nodded slowly. I confronted her in the garden, pleaded with her to reconsider, but she was determined. When the argument escalated, I lost control. I did not mean to kill her. It was a terrible accident. Miss Marple's eyes were steady. A tragedy born of desperation. The room was silent, save for the soft ticking of the clock and the steady breathing of those present. The fragile peace of Netherdine had been shattered, but truth and justice at last restored, as Ashcombe was led away. By Craddock, Miss Marple turned to the others. Secrets once revealed may hurt, but they also heal. Let us hope the village can find its way back to kindness and trust. Later, in the quietude of her cottage, Miss Marple reflected on human nature, its frailties, fears, and the unexpected courage it sometimes summoned. The widow's will had changed overnight indeed, but it was the human heart that had changed most of all. And so Netherdine settled once more into its peaceful rhythms, the memory of the night's dark revelations lingering like a shadow, an enduring reminder of the truth Miss Marple had uncovered, with nothing more than gentle observation and an unerring understanding of the human soul.